Nobody expected this game to turn into one of the most talked about moments of the preseason, but that's exactly what happened. On the surface, it looked like a routine matchup, the kind you'd normally scroll past without a second thought. The broadcast treated it that way too. Clean angles, standard commentary, nothing out of the ordinary. But while everyone was focused on the ball, something else was unfolding just outside the frame, something far more intense. And the moment fans started uploading their own footage, the entire narrative began to shift. What viewers thought they saw suddenly didn't match what was actually happening. Within hours, clips from the crowd started spreading everywhere, and that's when things took a sharp turn. The raw angles revealed a level of physicality and tension that the main coverage barely touched. It wasn't just about tough defense or playoff-style energy. It felt targeted, deliberate, and unusually aggressive for a preseason game. And right at the center of it all were three names that instantly sparked debate across the league: Sophie Cunningham, Cunningham Clark, and Breanna Stewart. What started as just a few viral clips quickly turned into a full-blown conversation, with fans dissecting every frame and arguing over what was really going on. At first, it seemed like just another physical game, nothing unusual for high-level basketball. But when people began slowing the footage down, analyzing movements, reactions, and positioning, the tone of the discussion changed. Certain moments stood out more than others. Contact that looked routine at full speed suddenly felt different when replayed. Reactions didn't always match the level of impact, and that's where the speculation began. Some viewers believed it crossed a line, while others insisted it was just part of the game. But almost everyone agreed on one thing: something about this felt off. Then came the sequence that changed everything. One moment that didn't just add to the conversation, it completely took over. A collision that sparked immediate reactions, followed by a response that no one saw coming. Because instead of backing off or letting it go, Sophie Cunningham did something else entirely. She flipped the energy of the game in an instant. Every movement after that carried weight. Every screen felt intentional. Every possession started to look like a message rather than just a play. And once that shift happened, it was impossible to ignore. But what really pulled people in wasn't just the intensity. It was the possibility that this wasn't random at all. There's been growing buzz online suggesting that what unfolded during that game may have been part of a bigger pattern, especially when it comes to how defenses are approaching Cunningham Clark. Nothing confirmed, nothing official, but enough moments to make fans start connecting dots. And once you start looking at it that way, everything from that game begins to feel a little different. Because the truth is, once you see that moment clearly, you can't unsee it. And what it might mean going forward is exactly why everyone is still talking about it. The moment that set everything off didn't happen during a highlight play, and it definitely wasn't something the broadcast focused on. It happened quietly, almost in the background, during an off-ball sequence that most viewers would have missed in real time. But once the fan footage surfaced, that single interaction became the center of the entire conversation. It showed Breanna Stewart and Sophie Cunningham crossing paths in a way that immediately split opinions. At full speed, it looked like standard physical contact, but slowed down, frame by frame, it raised a lot more questions than answers. As Cunningham moved along the perimeter, trying to position herself within the offense, Stewart stepped into her path. Now, screens and contact are part of the game, no one disputes that. But what caught attention was how the contact happened. Some angles appear to show Stewart leaning forward into the collision, rather than holding a neutral position. It wasn't just a bump, it looked forceful enough to disrupt Cunningham's balance entirely. And almost instantly after the contact, Stewart raised her hands, signaling innocence as if nothing unusual had just happened. That reaction alone added fuel to the debate. This is where the conversation really starts to divide. Some fans argue it was simply high-level physical basketball, nothing more than two competitors fighting for space.
Others believe the motion crossed into something more aggressive, something that didn't quite align with a typical legal screen. There's no official ruling that settles it definitively, which is exactly why the clip spread so fast. People started replaying it, zooming in, analyzing body positioning, trying to figure out intent. And the more they watched, the more it felt like this wasn't just another routine play. What made it even more interesting was Cunningham's response. There was no dramatic fall, no immediate appeal to the referee, no visible frustration. She absorbed the contact, reset herself, and stayed locked into the game. That reaction stood in sharp contrast to the intensity of the moment. It didn't de-escalate anything. In fact, it seemed to do the opposite. It was almost like a silent acknowledgement that something had just shifted, even if nothing was said out loud. And that's exactly why this moment matters so much. It wasn't loud, it wasn't obvious, but it changed the tone. Because right after this sequence, the way Cunningham played began to look different. More deliberate, more physical, more focused on controlling space rather than just moving through it. It felt less like a reaction to a single play and more like a response to something bigger happening on the court. And once you notice that shift, the rest of the game starts to look completely different.
As the clips kept circulating, the focus slowly shifted away from that one collision and onto a much bigger pattern unfolding throughout the game. Because when you zoom out and watch multiple possessions back to back, one thing becomes hard to ignore. Caitlin Clark wasn't just being defended, she was being constantly pressured at a level that stood out even for professional basketball. Every time she touched the ball, there was immediate contact. Hands checking her movement, defenders crowding her space before she could even initiate offense, bodies leaning into her path the moment she tried to create separation. It wasn't one play, it was every play. Now, to be fair, physical defense is nothing new, especially against a high-impact player like Clark. Teams are always going to test limits, especially against someone who can completely control the pace of a game. But what had fans talking was how consistent and aggressive it looked across the entire stretch. It didn't feel situational, it felt systematic, and that's where the speculation started to build. Some viewers began suggesting that this might be more than just standard defense, that teams could be intentionally pushing the boundaries of what officials would allow, especially knowing that not every off-ball moment gets called. There's been growing discussion online around this exact idea, not confirmed, not proven, but definitely being talked about. The theory is simple. If referees aren't calling every instance of hand checking or off-ball contact, then defenses might take advantage of that gray area, especially against a player like Clark, who relies heavily on rhythm and space. Disrupt that rhythm early, apply pressure constantly, and you force adjustments. Whether that's actually the strategy or not, the clips from this game gave that conversation new momentum. And then there's the context that makes it even more serious. Caitlin Clark's early career has already shown what happens when that level of contact builds up over time. The physical toll isn't always visible in one game, but over weeks it adds up. Fans have pointed out that repeated heavy contact, especially when it goes unchecked, can wear a player down both physically and mentally. That's why moments like this don't just feel intense, they feel important, because they raise a bigger question about how far defenses are willing to go and how much is going to be allowed. But here's where everything starts to connect. Because while this pressure on Clark was building possession after possession, someone else on the court was clearly paying attention, someone who wasn't just reacting to the ball, but to the pattern behind it. And that's exactly when the energy of the game began to shift again, because Sophie Cunningham wasn't about to let it continue unchecked. You can almost pinpoint the exact moment it happened. The shift wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was unmistakable. Something in Sophie Cunningham's approach changed, and from that point forward, she wasn't just another player moving within the offense, she became a presence. Every possession she was involved in started to feel heavier, more deliberate, like there was a clear intention behind every step she took on the floor. It wasn't about scoring anymore or filling a stat sheet, it was about control. Control of space, control of tempo, and most importantly, control of how close defenders could get to Caitlin Clark. Instead of drifting through plays, Cunningham began planting herself directly between Clark and incoming pressure. Screens that might have looked routine earlier suddenly carried real force. She wasn't just setting picks, she was holding her ground, making defenders think twice before trying to fight through. And what made it stand out wasn't just the physicality, but the timing. These weren't random moments, they came exactly when pressure on Clark was building. Every time a defender tried to crowd or close in, Cunningham was there a split second earlier, inserting herself into that space and disrupting the entire sequence. One particular stretch captured everyone's attention. Clark was driving into traffic, and from the weak side, a defender began closing the gap quickly. Out of nowhere, Cunningham stepped in and set a firm, perfectly positioned screen that completely changed the path of that play. It wasn't flashy, it didn't show up as a highlight dunk or deep three, but it sent a message. The defender didn't just get stopped, they got forced into a decision they weren't ready for. And almost immediately, you could see the reaction. Arms thrown up, body falling back, an attempt to draw attention. But the contrast was clear. Where earlier contact had sparked debate, this moment looked controlled, calculated, and intentional within the flow of the game. That's where the narrative really started to form. Fans began calling it an enforcer switch, not because Cunningham was doing anything outside the rules, but because of how aggressively she was operating within them. She wasn't reacting emotionally, she was adjusting strategically. There's a difference, and people picked up on it quickly. Every screen, every position she took felt like a response to the pressure Clark had been facing. Not reckless, not chaotic, just firm, unapologetic basketball.
And what made it even more compelling was how different the reactions looked on both sides. When Cunningham absorbed contact earlier, she stayed composed, barely acknowledging it. But when defenders ran into her screens, the responses suddenly became exaggerated, almost theatrical at times. That contrast only added more fuel to the debate. Was this just tough, disciplined basketball, or was it pushing the edge of what officials typically allow? Either way, one thing became clear. Cunningham had changed the tone of the game without saying a word. From that point on, nothing felt neutral anymore. Every possession carried tension, every interaction had weight, and every movement seemed to build on the last. And once fans recognized what was happening, the conversation exploded. Because this wasn't just about one player stepping up, it was about a role being fully embraced in real time, right in front of everyone watching. It didn't take long for the internet to latch on to what was happening, and once it did, the narrative took on a life of its own. Clips of Sophie Cunningham stepping into space, setting those hard screens, and physically positioning herself between defenders and Caitlin Clark started circulating everywhere. Within hours, a label began to stick: bodyguard. Not in an official sense, not something anyone on the team said outright, but a fan-driven identity that spread fast and hit hard. The idea was simple. While Clark handled the offense, Cunningham was making sure she had the room to actually operate in the first place. What made this narrative explode wasn't just the clips themselves, but how differently people interpreted them. On one side, fans praised Cunningham's toughness, calling it exactly what the game needed. They saw discipline, timing, and a willingness to do the physical work that often goes unnoticed. To them, this wasn't excessive, it was necessary, especially against the kind of pressure Clark had been facing all game. But on the other side, critics weren't convinced. Some argued that the screens were riding the edge, that the physicality was borderline, and that it risked escalating the intensity even further. Same clips, completely different conclusions. That divide is exactly what fueled the conversation. Every replay turned into a debate. Was this smart, controlled basketball, or was it a step too far? Was Cunningham protecting her teammate or provoking more contact? The answers depended on who you asked, and that uncertainty kept people watching, rewatching, and arguing. It wasn't just about the plays themselves anymore. It was about what those plays represented. A shift in tone, a shift in strategy, and maybe even a shift in how the game is being played at this level. And then came the comparisons. Fans started putting side-by-side moments together. Cunningham absorbing contact earlier without reaction versus defenders dramatically falling off screens later. Those contrasts only amplified the narrative. It made everything feel more intentional, more calculated. Whether that perception is accurate or not, it's what people believed they were seeing. And in moments like this, perception can be just as powerful as reality. But the most important part of all this wasn't just the reactions, it was what those reactions hinted at. Because when a single role, like this so-called bodyguard presence, becomes the center of conversation, it usually means something deeper is happening underneath. And in this case, it pointed directly back to the bigger picture surrounding Clark, the physicality she's facing, and how teams and now teammates are responding to it. And once that connection started to click, the discussion moved beyond just one game entirely. What makes all of this hit differently is the story behind it, because Sophie Cunningham didn't just show up and decide to play this role out of nowhere. There's a reason the intensity looked so deliberate, and it starts months before this game ever happened. Not long ago, she was dealing with a serious knee injury, an MCL tear that forced her into a long, uncertain recovery process. For 9 months, there were no highlights, no viral clips, just rehab, repetition, and the constant question of whether her body would respond the same way again. That kind of stretch changes how a player approaches everything, especially the physical side of the game. And then came the contract situation, which adds another layer entirely. Instead of a long-term, secure deal, she signed a 1-year contract that many fans believe undervalues what she brings to the floor. It wasn't a move driven by comfort. It looked more like a calculated bet, a chance to prove something, not just about her skill set, but about her role, her durability, and her impact on a team that's clearly building around Caitlin Clark. When you combine that kind of motivation with a player already known for physical play, it starts to explain why her presence in this game felt so intentional. There's also the mental side of coming back from an injury like that. Players don't just return physically, they return with something to establish. Every movement becomes a statement, every possession an opportunity to show that nothing has changed, or maybe even that something has improved. And in Cunningham's case, it didn't look like hesitation at all. If anything, it looked like the opposite, more decisive, more committed, more willing to embrace contact rather than avoid it. That alone shifts how opponents react, because it removes any sense of vulnerability they might have expected.
What's interesting is how that personal comeback story intersects with the role she's now playing. This isn't just about individual performance, it's about fit. About choosing to lean into a role that directly impacts how defenses approach Clark and the entire offense. Some players chase numbers after returning from injury. Cunningham appears to be doing something different, focusing on presence and influence instead. And that's not something that always shows up in the box score, but it shows up clearly on film, and even more clearly in how people are reacting to it. When you put all of that together, the recovery, the contract, the motivation, and the role, it starts to reframe everything you saw in that game. It doesn't feel random anymore. It feels like a player who knew exactly what she needed to bring the moment she stepped back on the court. And once you understand that, her impact in those viral moments starts to look less like a reaction and more like a statement. The moment this started gaining traction, it stopped being just about one game and turned into something the entire league has to pay attention to. Because what Sophie Cunningham is doing, intentionally or not, introduces a ripple effect that changes how teams approach every possession involving Caitlin Clark. It's what some fans are calling the enforcer effect. The idea is simple. If a defense knows that applying constant physical pressure on a star player will immediately be met with equal or greater physical resistance on the other end, it forces hesitation. And in a league where timing and spacing are everything, even a split-second hesitation can completely disrupt a defensive scheme. Think about the strategy from an opponent's perspective. If you crowd Clark, hand-check her, and try to wear her down over 4 quarters, that's already a risky approach. But now, with Cunningham actively inserting herself into those same spaces, setting firm screens and controlling positioning, that risk doubles. Suddenly, defenders aren't just thinking about stopping Clark, they're thinking about the cost of doing it. That changes behavior.
It changes angles. It changes how aggressively teams are willing to play. And over time, those small adjustments can completely reshape how an offense operates. But here's where it gets complicated and where the real issue begins. Not everyone agrees on where the line is. Some see Cunningham's style as a necessary counterbalance. Physical, yes, but still within the rules. Others argue that it's pushing the boundaries of what officials typically allow, especially when it comes to moving screens and off-ball contact. There's no clear consensus, and that lack of clarity is exactly what creates tension. Because if one team leans into this style successfully, others may start doing the same. And that's how the tone of an entire league can shift without any official rule change. There's also a broader question about officiating consistency. If certain types of contact aren't being called on one end, it naturally invites more of it on the other. That gray area becomes a space teams can exploit, and players will always adjust to whatever's being allowed in real time. What we're seeing here might just be an early example of that adjustment, not confirmed, not officially acknowledged, but definitely being discussed. And once those conversations start, they tend to spread quickly across locker rooms and coaching staffs. Then there's the roster and business side of it, which adds even more pressure to the situation. Cunningham is currently on a short-term deal, and if she continues to have this kind of visible impact, both on the court and in the public conversation, other teams are going to notice. There's already speculation among fans that franchises looking for toughness and edge could make a move in the future. Nothing guaranteed, but the possibility alone creates urgency for her current team. Because losing a player who can influence the game without needing the ball is something that's incredibly hard to replace. All of this is why this situation feels bigger than it looks at first glance. It's not just about physical screens or one viral clip. It's about how quickly the balance of play can shift when one player embraces a role that directly challenges how the game is being played. And if this continues, it won't stay isolated to one team or one matchup. It could quietly redefine how teams defend, how they respond, and how far they're willing to go to gain an edge. And just when the conversation felt like it had reached its peak, one more moment pushed it even further. But this time, it didn't happen on the court. It came after the game, in a completely different setting, and somehow it told you just as much about what's going on. Sophie Cunningham posted a short clip that quickly started making the rounds online. No breakdowns, no explanations, just a confident, almost playful celebration that instantly connected with fans. It wasn't over the top, but it carried a very clear message. She knew exactly what people were saying, and she leaned right into it. That moment mattered more than it might seem at first glance, because it showed that everything we just saw wasn't accidental or misunderstood, it was owned. The energy, the physicality, the presence on the court, it all translated into personality off it. And in today's game, that combination is powerful. Fans don't just follow performances anymore, they follow identities. And what Cunningham did in that moment was reinforce an identity that had already started forming during the game. Tough, unapologetic, and fully aware of her role.
But this isn't just about one player building a personal brand. It's starting to look like something bigger taking shape around the team itself. With Caitlin Clark leading the offense and players like Cunningham setting the tone physically, there's a clear sense of direction forming, not just in how they play, but in how they carry themselves. There's confidence there, there's edge, and most importantly, there's a willingness to embrace attention rather than avoid it. That's where the idea of a culture shift starts to come into play. Because teams don't just become recognizable overnight, it happens through moments like this. Viral clips, strong reactions, players leaning into roles that fans can immediately identify. Whether people agree with it or not, they're talking about it. And in a league where visibility is everything, that kind of attention matters. It builds identity, it builds narratives, and it makes every future game feel a little more charged. And now, every time this team steps onto the court, that energy comes with them. Opponents are aware of it, fans are expecting it, and the conversation is already waiting to continue. Because once a team establishes that kind of presence, it doesn't just disappear, it evolves. And when you step back from all the clips, the debates, and the viral reactions, it all leads to one question that nobody seems to agree on. What are we actually watching here? Is this just tough, high-level basketball played at the edge of intensity, or is it something that's starting to push beyond where the game is supposed to be? Because the same moments that one group of fans calls necessary toughness, another group sees as too far. And the truth is, both sides have a point. What makes this situation so compelling is how quickly it forces the league into a gray area. Players like Cunningham Clark are changing the speed, spacing, and overall demand of the game. Defenses are responding by getting more physical, trying to disrupt that rhythm before it ever gets going. And now, with someone like Sophie Cunningham stepping in and matching that intensity, the balance starts to shift again. It becomes a cycle. Pressure, response, counter-response, and every time it repeats, the line between physical and too physical gets a little harder to define. There's also a bigger picture here that goes beyond just one matchup. If this style continues to spread, if more teams start adopting this kind of edge, this kind of response, then the league itself could start to feel different. Not overnight, but gradually. Games become more intense, more confrontational, more debated. And while that can bring excitement and attention, it also raises questions about consistency, officiating, and player safety. None of those answers are clear right now, and that uncertainty is exactly why people are paying so much attention. But maybe that's the real reason this moment stuck. It's not just about what happened, it's about what it could lead to. Because once fans start questioning where the line is, and players start testing where that line can be, the entire dynamic of the game begins to evolve. And whether you see that as a positive shift or a growing concern probably depends on what you value most in the sport. Either way, one thing is certain, this isn't the last time we're going to see something like this. And the next time it happens, the reaction might be even bigger.